Thank you, John, and thanks to the folks at Berkeley for inviting Stanford to participate in this. I'm really happy to see the folks from Chile. We've had a long relationship between Stanford and Chile. Personally, mine goes back longer than I would care to admit. I mean, I knew the folks from the original California Chile project here. In fact, I think there's one still here. De Jean-Ry, I think, was involved back in the 60s and well, at least early 70s, where that project was highly agriculturally oriented. His economics department was involved. So I have the advantage here because this thing has been so long, you probably don't even remember what was said in the first hour. So I like to come back to that a little bit, and then I'll comment about the California system. I didn't realize until I got the slides, I don't pay attention to this stuff until the last minute usually, that what the discussion was going to be about, because I felt that I wouldn't have much to say. Unfortunately, now I have too much to say, so I'm going to try to keep it to 10 minutes, which is generally what people can listen to in one gulp. So let me talk a little about public versus private. I think it's a really important issue. I think Carolina's presentation was right on. I agree with the way she framed the topic. I'm going to remind you a little bit about those issues, and it fits very well with what the Berkeley folks have been trying to say about the role of the UC system as opposed to the role of the private universities. I agree totally with your remarks. There's no question that the public universities in California play a different role than the private universities. And I think it's really important that the public university system plays that role. So what does it mean? Why is it that a public university system, even though the funding is predominantly now not from the state, why is it different from a private university? I think it's really important to keep in mind. I mean, Católica in Chile is not the University of Chile. First of all, it's a religious institution, which nobody mentioned, and it has a religious function. There are crosses everywhere in the university. Should keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that everybody there is religious. It just means that there is this function that the University of Chile, the University of Chile is a secular institution. Many of the private universities are secular institutions in Chile, in fact, the bulk of them. But the best private university in Chile, along with its sisters in other cities, happens to be a Catholic institution. And it is run by the church and adheres to a lot of stuff from the church. And we just have to keep that in mind. Even though, as I said, the people there don't necessarily feel that way about it, it does have that other function. So from an economist standpoint, what's really interesting about this, and to get into the current, I'd love to get into the current debate in Chile. With the OECD report, have you read that report, that OECD report of 2003? I'm very proud of that report. I was the coordinator. And I was blamed for its radical nature, but in fact, I will tell here publicly that I actually had to contain some of the other people on the panel who tried to make it even more radical. I mean, I found a strange position because I usually take the most radical position. But in this case, I had to assure my Chilean counterparts that I was not the one who put in all this stuff. But that report focused a lot on the equity aspects of the Chilean system, not just the university system, but including the university system. And what's interesting to me is that, first of all, education is both a private and public good. And we just got to get that down. I mean, when you have a 20% rate of return per year to completing university in Chile, I don't know what the latest data are, but certainly in the late 2010, in the first decade, in the later part of the first decade, it was 20% a year. So you earned 100% more than a secondary school graduate if you completed university. I mean, that's a high rate of return. And by the way, that's including the tuition that's being paid, high as it is. It's still that higher rate of return. Well, if you have that high a rate of return on average, that doesn't mean going to business school, going to one of the better universities, that's on average. When you have that high a rate of return, that's a private good. There's a private benefit there. If you start telling people, oh, now you don't have to pay, that means the private benefit even goes up. Now, then Caroline raised the question, who gets this benefit? Who primarily gets this benefit? Is it everybody in Chile? No, it's not. This debate went on around the University of California in the 1960s, end of the 1960s. It was a famous debate among economists about whether tuition should be charged at the University of California. What was the debate about? Debate was who goes to the University of California? Who goes to the private universities? And you know something? The difference was very small at that time in terms of who goes. I looked at your figures, John, and there's one thing I found very interesting. The difference between low income percentage at Stanford and Berkeley was 18% versus 10.5%, okay? Which, by the way, does not coincide with the Pell Grant admits, which you claim are 32%. So who's getting these Pell Grants if they're not part of the low income? I think you should check these figures, by the way. So 16% at Stanford versus 32 or 34% at Berkeley.
Like that,
right. Versus 18% low income versus 11% low income.
I didn't see that.
You didn't see that? Check it out.
Sorry.
Because there's something weird about that. There's an interest of these universities to show that there are a lot of Pell Grant recipients. I'd like to know who those Pell Grant recipients are if they're not low income. So there isn't that much difference. I mean, it means that 82% versus 90% of students at Berkeley and Stanford are not low income. Okay, back in the beginning of the 70s, the difference in income family income per student between Berkeley and Stanford was exactly $1,000, $22,000 versus $21,000 at that time. Okay, so these were, at that time, that was quite a bit of money, and so is the family income. So I think it's really important, as Carolina, you said, who goes to university in Chile in general? And we know what the story is. Even with all this expansion, if you look at universities, the real universities, by the way, not just higher education, because there are a lot of other institutions in higher education, if you go, it would be interesting to know the social class of these students and how they differ between universities, because that's really important. So that's the first thing. Who benefits from this high rate of private rate of return? And so when we talk about giving a free university, we go to the Brazilian case. The Brazilian case is that the public universities are free, completely free, okay? The people that go to private universities happens to be of even higher social class in Brazil than they are in the public universities, as you might expect. Very few low-income people, bottom 40% of people in Brazil go to universities, very few. And the same is true in Chile. The bottom 40% just have a very, very low rate of going to universities, period, for various reasons. Part of it is the kind that they end up in. The system does not promote the low-income students from going to university. It doesn't promote them to do that. And then the university system itself doesn't care enough about this issue to change that. And by the way, the same thing is true in the United States. So Berkeley and the University of California can talk about how wonderful it is, but when you look up at the figures here, you see that the percent of Hispanic students, by the way, 50% of the K-12 students in the state are Hispanic in California now, 50% Hispanics. The percentage going to University of California in general, not just Berkeley, even if you include Merced, is way below that. I mean, it's probably 12 or 15%.
Yeah, you're about right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's
So
high
it's way below that. Yeah. The implications for California are enormous. And John had it right on. The problem is that California has the largest two-year system and the highest percentage of students going to two-year colleges in the country. It's way out of proportion. And a good comparison is to make is with Texas. Texas is a state that has a somewhat smaller percentage of minorities in the population, if you include of disadvantaged minorities. If you include blacks and Hispanics, about 46 or 47%, versus in California closer to 53 or 54% in the K-12 system. Okay, and so maybe it's higher in Texas. But in any case, the difference in the percentage of Hispanics going to four-year universities in Texas is much higher than in California. And the reason is just what Burton Clark called it years ago, the cooling out process of these two-year universities. The cooling out. It's worse than that. They put them in remedial education, and by the end of 2 years of remedial education, the last thing they want to talk about is trying to finish, if they even get through the first 2 years of remedial education. So the system is really geared to keep, I'm not saying it's consciously geared, it just is geared to keeping the lowest income people out of the University of California on average. Now, it's true they opened the Merced campus, et cetera. So if the private sector is clearly not interested in this at all. They're mildly interested. I mean, Stanford does some stuff, you know, and other private universities does some stuff to have low-income students. But it's really up to the university, the public system, to do this stuff. And the same thing is true in Chile. It's up to the public system to do this, you know. The private system will always be maximizing other things. And it's only, and I think that's what distinguishes it. It doesn't matter where the funding is coming from. It's how do you fix the objective of the public system to serve the public? Because it really is not the private universities whose objective it is to serve the public. They may talk about it. There are externalities associated with people finishing private universities, no question about it. Large externalities, but that isn't what they're supposed to be about. It's in the charter of most public universities that they're supposed to serve the public. That's not in the charter of private universities. Just not there. And it's not there in Chile either. So I would be concerned with the public system and what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to arrange itself. And by the way, the last thing I would do is not charge tuition to people in public universities. This would be a gross mistake, and I'll tell you why. I had a very interesting conversation with Georgia Jackson when he was here in California a few years ago. And I was really convinced by him that if you could do it, it would be much better to do what the French and the Swedes and everybody else do, is just tax the hell out of the rich and then provide free public higher education. Make them pay for it, okay? It's not copper exports tax, like in the old days in Chile. That's what paid for higher education. But a wealth tax plus an income tax on the rich, that's what they do in France. They collect so high taxes that the middle class and the upper middle class feel it's their right to go to university. And they're correct. They pay such high taxes that they feel they should have free university. So that's what Jackson wants. That's the objective. Here's the problem. The problem is in France you can collect those taxes, okay? And there's a high percentage of people who actually are taxable at high rates. But that's not true in Chile. In Chile, A, you can't collect the taxes, and B, there's a relatively small fraction, even though it's the richest per capita country in Latin America, there's still a relatively small fraction of people that you can just tax the hell out of in order to collect enough money to pay for the university. So what is the alternative? There's only one alternative, and that is make university free for people that can't pay, as it is becoming anyway in Chile. And secondly, collect more than you need, raise the tuition on people who can pay and want to get into the best universities, raise the tuition, make it higher than it is now, tax them at the front end, it's called a user tax, have them pay for the thing. By the way, I agree with this at the University of California too. I hate to say this, I disagree with my hero, Jerry Brown. I think that there are a lot of people that make it into the university, into Berkeley, that are just getting around to going to Stanford. The School of Engineering at Berkeley is loaded with people that can pay a lot more than they're paying. I'm sorry to say that. And subsidize people and to reduce the tuition on people that can't pay. In other words, user tax. I, as a California taxpayer, don't want to subsidize people that earn more than I do to send their kids to the University of California. I really don't want to do that. I'm sorry. I don't care what the public good is at the end of the line. It's not my idea. It's not my idea of how education should run, particularly higher education, when the rates of return to these people are pretty high. You just showed. You ran up the table here. They earn just as much as the graduates from Stanford.
Well, I think the argument is made that low tuition is in fact a subsidy to very wealthy people and their children.
No, it's not entirely, but it's partially. Partially it is. And the same thing is true. The same thing is true in Chile. In Chile, the percentage is higher. But anyway, so that's that issue. Let me just make. I have very little else to say. I've already talked too long. I think you raised other issues which are really important. The social role of the university, which was so well articulated by you, Henry, the social role of the university is so important. And to tell you the truth, I don't think Stanford can stand around and make that same. Don Kennedy, a former president, used to say, do public service, et cetera. He had a real vision of our graduates doing that. But now we really are rich you. We're interested, basically it's money, 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 go out and form your own company, et cetera, and things like that. And this is a very negative thing. But so it's really up to the public university to get the whole system in order in such a way that it performs this function. And maybe if it does that, it will drag us behind them, force us to be more like that. I mean, there's a lot of lip service at the university, but it's not this. And that's what I really think is so important on this public versus private. It does really make a difference whether a university is public. You just got to get off of who's funding it, I mean, the funding, state funding has gone down all around the country. By the way, there's huge variation among states. I don't know if you know this, but 62% of the students in Massachusetts go to private universities. Okay, it's the highest in the country, but it's historical. It wasn't a conscious decision by the state. And in California, I think it's about 23% for four-year universities. So I think that the important thing is that we get off this idea that it's that cost sharing means privatization. It does not. I always pose this to the Brazilians. They hate me for this. And I ask them, I say, is Pemex, I'm not Pemex, it's Mexican, Petrobras, is Petrobras a public company or a private company? And of course, they all answer, it's a public company. It's owned by the state. And I said, and there's good reason for that, right? You don't want private companies owning the natural resources, it's oil, the important natural resources of the Brazilian nation. You want to have control. You want the public to control what's happening with the natural resources, okay? So I asked them this. I said, when you go and buy gas, Petrobras gas, do you pay for it or is it free? Of course, you have to pay for the gas. It doesn't make it less of a public company because you have to pay for the services, okay? Now, it's clear to most people that gas is not both a public and private good, although you could argue that, you may worry about the price of gas so you can get more cheaper freight transportation and things like that, so there might be externalities of that. But in education, it's clear that there's a private element to education, private element, so people should share the cost. And there's the equity element. In California, the debate also went to who pays taxes versus who gets to go to the University of California. So the original argument by Hanson Weisbrod was that it's rich kids go to the University of California, therefore they should pay. And then Joe Peckman came back and said, but the rich also pay the taxes, so they should get these benefits. And that's if you assume that people should get equal benefits for the taxes that they pay. But most people don't agree with that. Of course, for the most part, the poor pay more taxes than the benefits they get, and the rich pay less taxes than the benefits they get. But in this case, you can see it quite clearly. And so it should be done in a way, and that accounting is easy to do. It just takes some data. And I'm sure Chile's loaded with data. I'm sure you have the data to calculate this. You can really figure out who pays, where they go, how much they pay, how much taxes they pay, and you can do this calculation. You can do it for Brazil too. And it ends up that the rich pay more taxes and they get the lion's share of the benefits from higher education. If you want to equalize stuff, you got to change that equation. You got to charge the rich more, and you have to, in one way or another, have them pay higher general taxes or higher user taxes, and end up subsidizing the poor to get to university, and subsidizing and increasing, as Chile is, increasing the amount of money that goes into and the amount of effort that goes into making sure that more poor kids get the kind of preparation that they can go to the best universities. We have a huge problem here in that regard, and we're not doing much about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Martin. So we'll just go for maybe 8 minutes here, and then I know you're hungry, and you want to get up and stretch and other things, but let's just have at least a little bit more time for some discussion. Yes, Saul, and please, short questions or comments.
Okay, what if the issue is not public versus private, but really it's the difference between a public university and a publicly supported research university? It seems to me that the real issue is, for both California and Chile, is the continuing role for a research university, not just a university, but a research university in the face of a broad demand for public access and lowered costs. And in a way, the public can be, the concerns of the public who see the university only as an undergraduate production BA facility can be an impediment to that end of keeping a research university. Chile, the Pinochet area, the Chicago boys, people are very ambivalent about that, but it did create a world-class research university there, probably the best in South America. Berkeley, the master plan that John talked about, created this system that, because of its articulation with all the three elements, permitted the growth of a world-class research university that was publicly supported, a unique kind of institution. So it seems there's a great parallelism between what's happening in Chile now with the demand for broad access. What happens to the public research university in those situations?
Why don't we let our Chilean colleagues make a comment on that? Do you want to make a comment on Saul's?
I would like to.
Yes.
No, I was just surprised by the mention of Pinochet, because I don't think that Pinochet had anything to do with good research universities in Chile. In fact, still the strongest university in terms of research in Chile is the University of Chile, and Pinochet for 17 years tried to destroy it. And yeah, and it's one of the real tremendous success of good academia was that it didn't let itself be destroyed by the work of the faculty, essentially. At that time that not only had to resist the political situation, but keep working hard in their disciplines. So, and I don't think the Catholic University is the product of Pinochet either. So, in fact, Chilean academia survived with great difficulty the Pinochet time.
Yeah. So, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Again, wonderful presentation. And my question is, since you all mentioned that faculty and student learning experience matter a lot now, do you foresee a greater emphasis and growth of faculty development and centers for teaching and learning in higher education?
Yes.
Here, please.
I like that.
Yes. I mean, I just think yes. I think we're taking teaching much more seriously, and I think we're going to continue to do that. And I think that's a good thing. I'm glad about that. I want to see more of that because I think teaching is really important. I feel for myself, for example, is I had a pretty good research career, but I also believe that actually one of my biggest contributions was the students I taught. And I wish more faculty members understood that their marginal paper is probably nowhere near worth as much as a little more teaching.
So do we have one over here and then one over there? So go ahead.
Just a question about the meaning of public, and then I get very confused about the word, because it looks like it's used to equate to the overall population. But in fact, and I think it's really what we mean by public is really the state or the government. And when we say that the regions represent the public, it really represent the government rather than the 90% of the population. And so, and also if you look at the structure of the California system, and we see that 2.4 goes to the CUC, 2.0 goes to state, and the majority stay in a community college, whether they get an AA degree or don't, right? And it's really, I think that Henry really put a nice point in it. It's really sort of like a kind of a system that keep people from going to real university. So I'm just concerned about the public, and when we say public goods, is really serving the whole population so that we can educate everybody really equally, or we are still really selectively make the selective elite education available to the poorer population, but eventually they become social mobile and move to the latter. We still have the same system of the 10% versus 90%.
So maybe over here for this, yes.
Question for the Dean. You mentioned in your remarks that your endowment in the past decades has gone down. What are the top 2 reasons that it's gone down, and what do you anticipate for the future, in the next 5 to 10 years, with regard to the endowment creep?
Are you talking to me? Because I'm not sure I said that.
I thought you had mentioned that the endowment was reducing, that the amount of reserve funds was going down in your public policy area.
No, I mean, my endowment's gone up because of fundraising. So my endowment's gone up. It's increasingly an important thing we have to do to raise money for the endowment so that we can sustain ourselves given the disinvestment by the state. So for example, essentially all of my staff are now funded on non-state monies. I have about 20, 25 staff, and maybe 2 or 3 of them are funded by state monies, and all the rest are funded either by students through tuition and what's called the professional degree supplemental tuition, or through endowment, the earnings from the endowment. But no, endowment's gone up.
So one more question or comment? Yes. Use the mic.
I am from Korea because in your presentation, there's Korean data in higher education. Korea is very typical higher education system. We are heavily dependent on private university, and about 80% in the number of student enrollment, and also in the numbers of universities are private universities, 80%. So Korea is very typical system, and also we are facing very severe, financial issues in public university and also private university, like as a UC system. And private university didn't receive at all from the government for the ordinary budget. And so the public university suffering from the government funding. So recently, the public university started to transform the governance system to a corporatized system, to have more funding outside. So in general, in Korea, the private university and the public universities' role are very convergent to each other, very convergent in recruiting students, in funding, budget, everything. For example, our university, private university, introduced 5 years ago in recruiting students from low-class income and student need-based student about every year several hundred students every year. So that's the one. And the other one, as mentioned, Carol and Henry, also you answered. In the research university, also my university, faculties enjoying their research in their offices, closing door, focusing on research. Then, in particular, undergraduate education. Nowadays, we are very weakening in undergraduate. So how can we compromise in research university to maintain excellent research quality and as well as undergraduate education?
Okay, I think we need to wrap up. We're already a little bit behind schedule, and I do want to say that I thought that we had a really invigorating, broadly defined discussion of what the public role and purpose of universities are, and obviously it's a vast array, and it's something that I think we can work at to perhaps create a much stronger framework to talk about it in terms of international comparative. We see a theme over and over again, which is that the declining in public investment is somehow changing the nature of that public role. And the question is, how do universities cope with that? But there are also major traditional changes between, say, the publics and the privates, or say what we have here in California versus what I would say we see in the institutions at the University of Chile. Yes?
Yeah, Henry raised a really interesting point about charging tuition. I think it's worth a discussion because he said that, if you have students paying more tuition, you're going to be more conscious of what you do with them. I have to tell you, at Stanford, we charge a lot of tuition. The master's students, most of them just pay full ride. And I have to say this, we really have to pay attention to those master's students. You cannot, I don't care how much you like research, if you don't do that, you're going to create a situation where you're not going to have them coming anymore. So you've got to do that. So there is
the undergraduates idolize us, and the PhDs want to be like us, and the master's students don't want to be either of those things. And therefore, all they want from us, I'm serious, all they want from us is a good education.
Exactly. And so I just want to say that I don't, first of all, let me say that, research money in the United States and in most countries of the world is highly concentrated in a few universities. So 25 universities in the United States get something like 80% of all federal research money. Fortunately for Berkeley and Stanford, we're two of them. UCLA is another. But in general, the 20% is spread among a bunch of places, but the fact it's highly concentrated. The University of Washington, I was shocked to see, just a few years ago, got $1 billion in stuff from the federal government. $1 billion. I'm sure it's associated with military and stuff, but the important thing is, on the public versus private, I think you've just got to separate. The question is, is charging tuition make you less public at the University of California? And the debate that all of you raised about whom you bring into the university to get that tuition, if you could raise tuition on in-state students, they'd scream and yell, but on the richer in-state students, you wouldn't have to take more international students. It's a real problem.
Well, the fact
I'm with you on this, by the way.
Well, the fact
Our
of the matter,
students are not, by the way.
well, the fact of the matter is that is the path. It's just whether at what speed, because there is no turning back to a highly subsidized system. So with that, I do want to thank our panelists and thank you for your patience. And now to remind you that we do have a nice reception that is funded and supported by the Chile, California Council. So please enjoy yourself and have an opportunity to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.